We afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Veronica Monty. As it was said earlier, I'm a physics teacher in Newport News, Virginia. Today, we have an amazing speaker, and I pray that you looked at the video before coming and you kind of heard what she is trying to deliver to the world. But today, you get to answer some questions directly to her after you listen to the video, after you view the video, and enjoy it. Please enjoy it. Speaker. Oh, okay, wait. Let me say this. I gotta say this. I have known Miss Latasha, because I call her Miss Latasha, for, oh my God, 16 years. The both of us, oh my God, I was truly a fan of hers. When I got to Caterpillar, that's where we met. She was our rising star as a Black female. And I emulated everything she did. Of course, I did her bio and I looked at how she did things. So can you imagine Miss Latasha on a continent of Asia try to sell some cat machines? That is remarkable. And she is very, I mean, I've been a fan forever. So please sit back and listen with your eyes closed and your ears open. Come on, Miss Latasha, let's do it.
Latasha Gillespie, everyone is a physicist. In full disclosure, prior to prepping for this talk, I had very little idea about what a physicist is or what a physicist does. Now, I was actually a bit surprised and relieved when I realized I actually knew more than I thought. As the most basic and fundamental science, physics is really crucial to understanding the world around us, the world inside us, and the world beyond us. It challenges our imaginations with concepts like relativity and string theory. It leads to great discoveries like computers and lasers. It improves the quality of our lives, from healing joints to curing cancer to developing sustainable energy solutions. Now, it's important that you know a little bit about me and how I approach this conversation. I have a very large extended family. I am married to a man who has taught elementary education and coached high school basketball for over 20 years. We have two sons who are now 21 and 23. I am one of 6 children with a lot of nieces and nephews, and now even great nieces and nephews. And the one thing that I know for sure is that most children are born into the world naturally curious, imaginative, creative, and inventive. They are curious about how the world works. From backyard camping and trying to understand exactly how the stars are hung in the sky, to the amazement of how boats manage to stay afloat, or perfecting that wrist placement to get the perfect spin on a softball pitch or the perfect spiral on a touchdown pass. Or my favorite, trying to understand the gravity-defying way airplanes deliver us to grandma's house. The applications of physics transcends gender, nationality, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, and social economic status. So the question today is, then why is it that the people who study and master physics don't always represent that same rich diversity? What happens between birth and high school that contributes to girls enrolling in high school physics and taking the AP physics exam at far lower rates than the boys in their class? Why are Black, Hispanic, and Native American students disproportionately not seeing physics as a viable educational path and career option for them? Now, I'm asking you because as educators, in many ways, you are on the front lines. You are our frontline responders of this pandemic of lack of representation in physics and science and greater STEM. But these are also questions I'm continually asking myself. I'm facing similar problems in a different industry. Because see, just like everyone is a physicist, Everyone is a storyteller. From a very young age, kids are storytellers. They're having tea parties with their stuffed animals and Barbie dolls. I've seen the most innovative world creations with a set of Legos. And I know all too well how kids occupy their minds and even consider the perspectives of others through the world they create with imaginary friends. Now, many of them actually grow up to be aspiring creatives, writers, directors, filmmakers, actors. But unfortunately, like with physicists, the richness of their different lived experience gets watered down as the very old gatekeeping systems of Hollywood make it harder and harder for some to break through versus others. You could look at any body of research from Gina Davis Institute to USC, Annenberg, UCLA, or a number of other credible sources. The television and film industry is still very white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual, and able-bodied centered, because it also happens to be the people who mostly get to decide what stories we tell or greenlight. And when I'm talking about greenlighting, I mean the process that we go through in Hollywood of giving the approval to make the content, of actually deciding which stories we are going to choose to tell that eventually show up in your living rooms or in your local cinemas. It's the decisions to cast the people who actually get the speaking parts on camera. It's the decisions that hire the people who are equally important behind the camera and below the line. The people who control the lighting, transportation, costumes, hair and makeup. It's the process of approving marketing budgets and distribution strategies to make sure that a television series or film is successful in actually reaching its intended audience. And just like there's a group of people who get to greenlight content, in many ways, you as teachers have the ability to greenlight who becomes a future scientist, who becomes a physicist. I suspect that you and I, we encounter similar barriers, though we may call it different things. But let's examine it. If everyone is a physicist or a storyteller, then why is that not reflected in the world today? I think about Andrew. See, I mentioned earlier that my husband taught elementary school for 20 years, and I can remember when he was a first grade teacher, which in itself is its own story as a 6'2", 250 African-American man who is standing in the hallway waiting to greet a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds who are holding on to their parents. I'll tell you, for a lot of the parents, it was hard for them to imagine this man being their child's first grade teacher, mainly because men were typically only seen as the PE instructor. And even if they were teachers, usually not at that young of age, and definitely they were not used to seeing a Black man in that role. Some parents were very hesitant about leaving their children in the care of my husband. Some actually even complained to the principal and asked for their children to be moved. What was interesting though, is by the end of the school year, how many of those same parents actually recommended him to other parents coming in the next year. My husband had this student in his class named Andrew, and he would often complain about Andrew being a busybody, that he'd give the class an assignment, and sure enough, before everyone could finish, Andrew would be up around the room doing things that he had not been approved or authorized to do, causing a disruption. And as a public school teacher with 32 kids in your class, the last thing you need is someone not following the rules or instructions, right? And so my husband was frustrated, but he began to inquire and ask Andrew a series of questions and begin to know a little bit more about Andrew's home life. And what he realized is that Andrew grew up on computers. And unlike most of the kids in his class, in that first grade classroom, Andrew was far more proficient and advanced in many ways than many of his classmates. And so it wasn't that Andrew was a bad kid or that he was meaning to just be disrespectful or disruptive. Andrew was simply bored. My husband found a way to tap into Andrew's advanced capacity and deputized him to be the classroom helper. So when Andrew would finish his work early, as he often did, my husband would ask Andrew to help collect papers from other students or grade previous assignments or help set up for the next activity that they were going to do as a class. And when he found a way to tap into Andrew and began to actually utilize that advanced skill set and put it to good use, it became a far more positive experience for him and Andrew, and actually Andrew's peers, who oftentimes he was able to help alongside my husband in the classroom. Now, what was interesting about this is many years later, probably about 20 years later, we actually ran into Andrew's parents at a JFL football game. And I remember Andrew's mother immediately spotting my husband and recognizing him and coming up to him with this look of gratitude and joy and almost tears in her eyes as she began to tell him how well Andrew was doing, that Andrew was an engineer, and how she thanked him so much because she understood that as a young Black kid with a lot of energy and not always following the rules, in that first grade classroom, had he had any other teacher, Andrew might have been labeled as a troubled child. Andrew might have been labeled as a child with ADHD and been recommended for medication. Andrew may have had a label put on him in the system as early as 6 years old that could have stayed with him his entire educational career. But in this case, my husband had the ability to see the scientist in Andrew and therefore greenlit his educational path. You know, at Amazon Studios, we recently launched an inclusion policy and playbook as a mechanism to help us greenlight more inclusive content from creators of all backgrounds. And so today I want to talk to you about 4 mechanisms that you can employ to help you greenlight more globally inclusive physicists. The first thing is, don't judge your first thought, but judge how you think about your first thought. The second thing is, understand language matters. The third is assessing risk versus distance traveled. And lastly, take an equitable versus an equal approach. Don't judge your first thought. This is actually something I learned in therapy. My therapist explained to me, like, listen, Latasha, don't penalize yourself for the first thought that comes into your head. But instead of judging that first thought, judge how you think about that first thought and what actions you take as a result of it. This is really helpful for my husband in the classroom with Andrew. I mean, let's be honest. His first thought was he was annoyed. With 32 kids in a classroom and one kid that was particularly disruptive, it was not easy. But thankfully, he refused to accept that it was as simple as Andrew being disrespectful or Andrew being ADHD. He was willing to invest in Andrew and understand how to unlock Andrew in a way that would motivate him to be a productive part of that learning environment and that classroom experience. There are going to be kids who come into your classroom who don't have it all together, and sometimes they're going to be disruptive. And sometimes they're not going to have the popular vernacular. Sometimes they're not going to come with the access to technology that other students have, so they may seem a little bit behind. Sometimes they're going to remind you of another student you had who was a bit of a troublemaker, and you can't help but see them through that same lens. You can't judge your first thought. Your first thought is your first thought. But I am going to ask you to judge how you think about your first thought, how you respond to that first thought, and how you investigate to understand that student better. Second, understand language matters. Again, living with a school teacher, I learned a lot about the educational system. Like, teachers talk. No different than in the corporate world when we talk in the water cooler. Teachers talk. In the teacher's lounge, during recess duty, on in-service days, teachers talk about their classroom experiences. They talk about the students that give them joy, who they take pleasure in seeing light up as they're learning. But they also talk about the students who give them grief, the students who could be disruptive or problematic, even in the first grade. Your language matters. Your language is powerful. An endorsement or cautionary warning could have changed Andrew's entire educational trajectory. Could have impacted what college track he ended up on in high school. Could have had bearing on where he actually went to college if he had the ability to go at all. Could have impacted his life in terms of his educational and employment opportunities, and ultimately could have had generational impacts on the kind of educational opportunities for his family and their ability to acquire wealth. Another thing to think about as we talk about language is what things we choose to see as an anomaly. I think about in Hollywood, even when there's clear breakout performance, we're quick to say, oh, that was an anomaly and not the norm. You know, like Crazy Rich Asians or Black Panther, two movies who centered communities of color, created by creators of color, that had broad mass appeal globally to all kinds of people, right? But instead of accepting that everyone can appreciate quality content regardless of the nationality or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or religion or ability, physical or cognitive ability of the creator or cast, we're quick to put it in the category of, this one was out of the norm. Now, that's not just in Hollywood, that's even in sports. Right now, in the National Basketball Association, the NBA, out of 30 teams, there are only 7 African-American head coaches, despite the majority of the players being of color. And here we are now in the playoffs, and 3 of the 4 teams left in the playoffs have African-American head coaches. Again, rather than understanding that sometimes we have systemically denied opportunities to people who are qualified, who are capable, we like to write it off as an anomaly. And I'm sure the same thing happens in the science field. The 1 or 2 women that break out, we see as an anomaly and not as women who persevere despite all of the obstacles put in front of them. Which leads me to my third point. Risk versus distance traveled. Well, Gillespie, what do you mean by that? In Hollywood, we often use risk assessments to make green light decisions. And because of our own comfort level, we are more likely to green light a project from a white man who has failed repeatedly than a person of color, regardless of success and experience, and particularly if they have little to no experience. That pattern of familiarity makes it easier then for the next cisgen, able-bodied, straight white man to get his project greenlit. And just like in Hollywood, students in your classrooms sometimes benefit from or ride on the coattails of others' success, particularly when it's an older sibling, a previous star student that they remind you of, or especially if there's something about that student that reminds you of a younger version of yourself, right? Sometimes what we fail to appreciate is the students who we call risky. I like to call students who had a further distance to travel. My younger son, Miles, in high school had a great friend. His best friend was a guy by the name of Elijah, and they played on the football team together. They hung out together. Elijah ate dinner at my house probably 5 of 7 nights a week, and was usually at my house the entire weekend. Now, my son Miles comes from a household where he had 2 parents who were college graduates who forced him and pushed him into things like taking an ACT prep course or getting involved in an hour of code just to try it out and see if it's something he liked. And many times we would drag Elijah along with him. But Elijah didn't otherwise have that push. Neither of Elijah's parents graduated high school. He actually lived with an aunt who, despite him being a high school student and playing on the football team, he actually had to pay her rent. So he had to have a job after school to help support that as well. Now, I often say that if Miles and Elijah graduated from high school with the same GPA and ACT or SAT scores, which student should you hire? Elijah, even though I love Miles, because Elijah had a further distance to travel. There's students in your classroom right now, and they may not be the most polished. They may not have the highest GPAs in the class, but the success they have achieved, they've achieved it despite really big obstacles like unstable home conditions, food insecurities, the need to work while going to class full time, cognitive disabilities, but all because they are scrappy and persistent and relentless in their pursuit to learn. They've made it that far. And just like Elijah, at the end of the day, that is the student you want. That is the student that's going to persevere through obstacles. That is the student who will not accept failure as an option. It's that kind of tenacity that produces the Ava DuVernays or the Ryan Cooglers, the Nina Yangs, the Gloria Calderon-Collettes, the Lin-Manuel Mirandas of the world. Imagine how boring the world would be without their stories, right? But now imagine the world without the life-saving inventions, without the ingenuity of the students in your classroom who had a further distance to travel. And just like I'm convinced that no one can tell a story as authentically as someone who's had that lived experience, I'm equally convinced that no one can solve the really hard problems better than those who've lived through them, who've witnessed family members and others of their community overcome the hardships that come with them. These are your students who've had a further distance to travel. Last but definitely not least, I want to talk about what it means to take an equitable versus an equal approach. Now, the concept of equality sounds and feels noble, right? And it feels fair and like the right thing to do, except it doesn't take into account distance traveled. In our industry in Hollywood, we have to work harder to tell stories that center marginalized communities, because we've not done a great job of actually ensuring that those pipelines existed for those creatives to get the experiences that they need, or that those actors have had the kind of opportunities and access and credits to star in some of these projects. We have to be intentional in shooting and production, because we haven't always thought about things like lighting and makeup to make people look and feel authentic, right? And not as a caricature. We sometimes have to spend more money marketing these amazing stories, all because we have not always prioritized these audiences. I mean, think about it. Think about the biggest movie weekends of the year. It's usually like the 4th of July, Labor Day weekend, the Christmas holiday. Take a minute and think, how many of the movies that come out during those weekends center characters and stories from underrepresented communities? you're probably hard pressed to think of a few. Because oftentimes they're your big action movies who oftentimes are not written by people from those marginalized communities and don't star people from those marginalized communities. Yet, biggest streaming movie of this year that has broken every historical record of all time, Coming to America 2. Not a movie that just did well with Black audiences, but a movie that resonated with globally diverse audiences. Because sometimes when we build things for people on the margins, it benefits the masses. Think about sidewalk ramps, right? Sidewalk ramps were designed for people in wheelchairs to be able to safely cross the street. Yet you and I, who are able-bodied, we use them every day with our bicycles, with our grocery carts, with our baby strollers. So sometimes, to take an equitable approach, we have to work harder to get it right. We have to work harder to engage underserved communities authentically and earn their trust. And that trust doesn't come in one big swoop. It comes in every single decision, including who is credited in creating the content, who gets to show run the television series. Are we equitably paying all of our talent? Whose faces do we put on the key art and on the posters and in the trailers that you watch? How do we advertise the content, and where do we advertise the content? Are we cognizant about doing it in places that those communities exist, but also in broader mainstream media as well? All of this matters in ensuring equity. And in your world, that might look a little different. That might be who gets to participate on the research project, whose name gets to get added to the paper as author, who gets to be on the application for the patent, where the research is published, who gets published, who gets to present it. Think about the pathways to ensure that underrepresented physicists can succeed in all of these spaces, particularly spaces that are all white, particularly in spaces that weren't necessarily designed with their well-being in mind. How do you make it more equitable? How do you create an ecosystem that surrounds them, that supports them, that undergirds them, that takes into consideration they had a further distance to travel? Are there mentors? Are there sponsors? People who take active accountability for their success and shepherding them through the process? Are there mental health resources available to them? Because sometimes it's lonely being the only. These barriers are real, but they're not insurmountable. But it is going to take intention. Intentionality is so important. And it's also going to take collective accountability. It's going to take all of us doing our part. Me in Hollywood, you in the classroom, right? Because if we can not judge our first thought, but actually think about how we think about our first thought, if we can understand the power of language and that it matters, if we can learn to look at talent, not from the risk they present, but from the distance traveled, and if we are willing to take an equitable over an equal approach, I'm convinced that everyone can be a storyteller, and everyone can really be a physicist. Thank you.
Amazing job. We have a hand raised in the chat. Did you see that? I can't tell whether it's a male or female, So I'm gonna just say, because I don't see a picture. So the individual that has their hands raised, last name Afros, if you can please maybe turn on your camera. I knew that was you. I wasn't sure. Hey, don't ask your question.
All right. So I actually have a couple of comments and questions. So let's start off with the first one, which was, I love the story about Andrew, right? That's super inspiring. What would have happened if there was, instead of one, if there was 10 Andrews?
Yeah. And listen, sorry, finish your question. If there was 10 Andrews.
All right, so that's my first. My second question was, in your example of Elijah and Miles, right? They both scored the same on the ACT. They both had the same GPA by the end of it all. But because Elijah had a lot more to do, the probability would be much higher that he wouldn't score as high, right? So let's assume you have a 4.0 and then Elijah has a 3.0. Would he even be considered in that case with that 3.0?
Exactly. So in the case of Andrew, like, my heart goes out to public school teachers. Like I said, after living with my husband and seeing what you all do, it's God's work. So I understand that it's really difficult in those situations when you have that many students in the classroom and you are trying to make sure that everyone is learning, right? And you need those resources. So I'm not going to pretend and say that it's easy to find all of those or to be able to help all of those children in the same way. The one thing I would say is, I think when you're in a situation like that, that's where the equity has to come in, where we have to raise our hands and ask for help. Like, listen, I think I have some really bright students in here, but I also understand that they need to learn differently. And I think we've gotten so conditioned to teaching our children to standardize tests that we forget that the word education, right, comes from a Greek word, which means educerate, which means to pull out your God-given talents and gifts, not just like regurgitation. And so, I do think as a country, we have to think about our educational system and how we place value on certain things. But I also think as teachers, we need to better support you in the classroom when you have those large groups of students that really are sometimes unmanageable, even if there's not an Andrew. So I think we got to better support our teachers in terms of resources and funding. And I know that's a longer discussion, but difficult. But I would say at least try to see if there's a way you can make a small cohort of Andrews, right, to be your deputized helpers in any way that you can. And then the second question you asked me was about Elijah and Miles. And the question I asked was hypothetical. Miles and Elijah didn't end up graduating with the same GPA and ACT and SAT scores, but it was actually, I used that example in a conversation I had with Jeff Bezos, actually, at Amazon about, are we using the right measuring stick? Like, if our job is to find talent that raises the bar, are we using proxies that don't always tell the truth? A proxy could be an Ivy League institution. A proxy could be a GPA, right? But are we really finding the best talent based on the things that we know make people successful in life? And it is that scrappiness. It is that bias for action. It is that perseverance where the first time they get a setback, it doesn't completely knock them off their feet and they can't get back up. But it's those kids that have resilience because they've had no other choice, right? And it doesn't just have to come from students who come from underserved communities. That's not the only way you build resilience. I mean, students who come from affluent homes can also have it, but it's the characteristics we should be looking for, not the proxy.
Agreed. But can I just do a quick follow-up? So I absolutely agree with you. And I mean, there are two things that often bother me, right? It's something I've been often working on. But let's assume that you get to be able to hire like that, whether you're a university or whether you're at Amazon, you would need to go through everybody's holistic applications. If you get 30,000 applications and you have 2 months to go through them, typically we do put, okay, if we're thinking Harvard, will probably say like anybody below 1,400, we're not going to even look at, right?
Right.
Just narrow down at the beginning to be able to say, now among these, let's look at the holistic, right?
Right.
So though I agree with you that it is the scrappiness that matters, right?
Yeah.
It is the fact that I often say we mark students absent in the mornings who have come to school late, knowing that they worked overnight. That to me is just injustice, right? We need to find a program which allows these kids to have extra time because they're showing more responsibility than the child who's parents are putting them to bed and waking them up. That's just the reality. Like they're showing way more responsibility. But the end result is we also have this reality of 30,000 applications in 3 months to get through. How would you?
I know. I saw a study that was done. I want to say EY did it, and it's dated. A friend of mine was sharing with me, where they actually looked at some of their top performing people in a certain level, right? They said like 5 years out of college, I think, somewhere around there, where they looked at who were their top performers, and they did an analysis, a scientific way of looking at it, which you'll appreciate. What were the characteristics that some of those folks had in common going back to their resumes? And the thing that they found was interesting was GPA was not one of those statistical factors that basically had a strong correlation or causation to their success. It was the students who held a job while they were in school. It was the students who had internships, so they were seeking work experience. Like it was some of the things that they would not have thought about or valued had they not done an actual study to see what makes a good, employee in our organization. And I think at some point, you're the best at this. You're the best at doing scientific experiments and studies and being able to look and see, if we look at the students who have really done well in our programs and have really gone on to do some of the most innovative research, what were some of those characteristics that they had in common that had a strong correlation? And should those be the things we should be really putting more weight to on the application versus just the GPA or where they went to undergrad?
I could continue because this is a topic that's very close to my heart, so I'm just going to stay quiet. Thank you so much for your answers for now.
Listen, it was my pleasure. Thank you for being the brave one coming on first. And if there's not a whole lot of questions, don't stay quiet. Come back and ask more. So
Done.
We got another question, another hand raised. Please unmute yourself and talk to us.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Isa. Like we met briefly before your talk.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for bringing our focus back to this really important topic. I have a couple of comments, and then I'd like to get your insights on a question. So first, my comment is that I love the parallels between the entertainment industry and green lighting projects. I think that highlights, or it kind of like switched the focus for me as an educator into thinking about my work as somebody who greenlights, who gets what opportunities. I think there's something about it that is scary, honestly, but also empowering, right? In that it highlights the agency that teachers do have. A lot of the times, I think there's so much focus on the things we cannot do because educators are overworked, underpaid, all the things we know about. So I love that focus on green lighting, and thank you for that. Also, your 4 points, very powerful. Judge our first thoughts or first impressions, and I think that gets at stereotypes and the ideas we form about students and who looks like a scientist and who doesn't, or who performs like one and who doesn't. The power of language, considering the distance traveled, focusing on being equitable versus equal. That is all so great and beautiful. Thank you for that. Now, my question is about this problem that is systematic exclusion. And this is where I want to get your insights. So there are all these things that we can do to reframe our thinking and create more equitable opportunity. But this is systematic exclusion. And we have an individual responsibility to create an ecosystem. And you mentioned collective accountability, and I agree with all of those. But I'm wondering if you can say more about the challenges, or I don't know, I'm having a tough time articulating this because there's a disconnect, right? There's a systematic problem, but we're individuals.
Yeah.
So while we can do all these things, how can we become more effective being individuals in the system that feels like is constantly undoing, what I can do as a person in the classroom with one student?
Issa, you answered your own question with your first comment. This is why I love this. Is because, listen, I've been in the entertainment industry for a hot minute, right? I have a finance degree. I come from a manufacturing background. Like, who am I to think I can come in and change Hollywood? And there's all of these historical systems that have been in place that are easy for me to also be like, I'm a cog in the wheel. How do I make a difference? But what you said earlier was around understanding we all have power and agency. And so, and I was just having this talk with, she's a mentee of mine, but I call her my mentor. I have a bunch of mentors under 30 who are constantly challenging and teaching me. And she was saying to me yesterday, like, I don't know what I want to do next. And I said, stop saying that. I was like, because there's power in your words. I said, you do know. You know that you want to do a job that is collaborative because you like bouncing ideas and planning with other people. You know that. You know that you want to do a job that impacts customers of color. You've already decided that that's a lane you want to be in. You know that. You also already know that you want to work in a space where people value your expertise because either they also have it or they are willing to acknowledge what they don't know and get out of the way and let you do it. So there's so much that we do know and have that sometimes we forget because there are so many obstacles in front of us. So here's what I would say. I'm gonna give you my own personal example. I don't run a studio. I work for a woman who runs a studio. I haven't been in this industry a long time, so I don't have all of the connections and networks that some folks have. But here's what I do have. I have a position within Amazon Studios where I am responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what I have done is I have figured out what are the places, or what are the processes in our world that are standard to the work we do, like green lighting. It's a standard thing. Every piece of content has to happen. So the way I injected myself in that is I said, every green light document has to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment. Before we say yes to any piece of content, my team has to look at it and decide, does it have diverse representation that will improve our overall numbers? Does it have it in front of the camera and behind the camera? Does it have any negative stereotypes or tropes that could be harmful to you, our customers? They could, our biggest thing in Amazon Studios and in Amazon is customer obsession. We obsess over customers. And so I'm asking the question, is there anything in this content that could be harmful to customers? Because if so, we need to fix it. And if there is, what are the mitigation steps we have to fix it? So I'm trying to understand everything that is within my world and my bubble that I can influence and start there. And then I go inspire somebody else who owns a different part of the process in production and say, hey, you get to decide that Latina woman that we hire all the time for transportation, this woman has her own company, she has her own drivers. Most studios hire her to only be a driver. We can hire her to be head of transportation on that show. How many Latina women in the industry get that role? We can give her that role because we know she's qualified and can do it. Like, we can be very intentional about every single decision we make. And if I do it, and if I get you to do it, and if I get you to do it, we begin to change the system. But start with your own bubble. And I tell you, the success you're going to see because of it is going to be contagious. And people are going to be like, Issa, how did you do that?
Thank you for that. As you were talking, I was thinking about one of the questions that we can pose to this community, our bubble, is what is one thing or one step we can make today? What is one decision or choice we can make today that can help overcome exclusion in STEM within our own community and classroom? So I'm going to be meditating on that.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah.
Meditate. And listen, don't just tickle it.
Yeah.
Like, don't just go read books to a kindergarten classroom. This question that Issa is posing to all of you. Think about those systemic barriers. That's the question she asked. Like, let's get at the heart and the root of it. Where are people falling out of the pipeline? Go attack that one spot, right? Where are they falling out of the pipeline?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record to everyone that's heard this before, but it came up yesterday and I'm going to bring it up again. Assessment is like the obvious thing that comes to mind. So, but I'll leave it at that. I think assessment is one of the key things that we need to discuss. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you. I have a comment. I got my comments. I got a bunch. So the first comment I really want to say is, okay, let me make a statement. I said a comment, I'll make a statement. I'm a brand new teacher. And when she said, when Miss Latasha was saying, stay in your lane, I can understand what she's saying, because in my classroom, I have 111 students. I know about my 111 students. Now, I might not know about the other 1,400 that's in the building, but the 111 students that are under my care, I got them. So I stay in my lane and I do things based on what I see them. Well, I can say see, because you don't really see them on Zoom this pandemic, but I pay attention to how they communicate.
Yeah.
If they're communicating and they're using some vocabulary that makes sense to me, then I look at them a little different. So I love that concept that you said, Ms. Latasha, because if we stay in our lane and we do what's in our realm, it changes everything. Because I can't do what somebody does in their classroom. I can't worry about them, but I can take care of my students.
I can take care of mine.
Yes.
But even something you said that sparked something for me, again, as we think about who is a scientist, I often talk about this, especially when I was on the tech side at Amazon, Amazon Corporate. We write a lot of docs. So we are very doc heavy culture, where instead of PowerPoint, we actually flesh out our ideas through papers. And I think, and it's a great equitable mechanism for the introvert, right? So someone who doesn't have to stand up and present, but they can get all of their ideas out on paper. And then, like at Amazon, you come into a meeting, you spend the first 30 minutes reading the doc, and then you have discussion. It's like 30 minutes of silence. Everybody reads, and then you talk. And that's so helpful for the introvert who maybe not as strong a presenter, or when, a million questions get thrown at them, it's harder for them to, react on the spot, but they can get their full idea out on paper ahead of time, which is great. Now, that's a great mechanism for the introvert. But then how do you also make sure that it's equitable for someone where English is not their first language, right? So we all think and process in our native language. So when we're asking somebody to write a doc or read a doc and English is not their first language, are we allowing for the time and the space for them to be able to read it in that language, process it in their own language, and then formulate their response, their questions, their feedback in a way that can be received by the broader audience. So it's being intentional and just thinking about all those things and not assuming, well, if you're in this program, of course you know English. Yeah, I do, but doesn't mean I don't still process in my native language. Oh, we have a long comment. Let's see what this one says.
Well,
Eric?
can I just challenge you on this, that we process in our first language?
Okay.
English is not my first language. I do think in English.
Show your face for me, sir, so we can see you while you're talking.
I'm sorry?
We want to see some faces. We like seeing your faces.
So sir, and you are one of the talented and gifted people who can do that. And that's amazing. But we do oftentimes hear from some of our employees that, I naturally kind of process things in my native language first, and then, think about how I respond back in English. So again, if you have the ability to do that and, and that comes natural to you, that's amazing. But it's sometimes, I'm saying, understanding if for some folks, it may not come as naturally. So someone pointed out to me yesterday that when we send out scripts to actors, there's a watermark on the script because you want to protect it and IP and the whole thing. But if you're a blind actor and you're using a script reader, that watermark prevents it from reading it for you. And those are those intentional things that if we're being equitable, how are we thinking about the experience that everyone is having in our environment? Or do we assume everyone is having the same experience? But thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, sir. We have one more question, a hand raised. Please turn on your cameras and talk to us.
Tara. Hey.
Hi there.
Is it Tara or Tara?
It's Tara, but I've gotten Tara quite a bit, so fine. So my question, my school's been working really hard, so is our physics department, about representation, equitability. We're trying to overhaul our grading practices, assessment. I know that's a big one, but in terms of studies that our school's done from our student population, they feel like they lack support when it comes to some of those higher reaching classes, physics being one of them. In the corporate world, I feel like there's so many supports that a company offers. You've mentioned your mentorship abilities. Is there anything classroom teachers can do to scale some of these supports and mirror that corporations have found successful in making sure students feel welcomed, that they have a community who's there to help them and be their cheerleader, show them the way, so that they feel welcomed, they feel ownership, and we can help move them forward to all the good and great things they're going to do?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. And listen, we still have a long way to go in the corporate world, so I won't claim success yet. It's still day one, but yes. And I was I was reading when I was preparing for the talk and seeing how many women actually leave the physics world, as professionals or in education, and actually, drop out of it. And we saw the same drop off in tech as well. Like, a lot of times when women would leave a job, they wouldn't just leave the job, they would actually leave the field altogether. We're like, wow, that's really interesting. And so why are they leaving? Well, one is sometimes that whole unicorn feeling, right? So when you're the only, Nilofer Merchant coins a term called the onlyest. And it's the situation where when you're the only person that looks like you in a room or in an environment, it's very lonely when there's not a lot of people that have had your shared lived experience. Like, I lived in Singapore for a couple of years, so I know what it's like to live internationally in a country, right? And I laugh and joke about that because I actually felt very included in Singapore. And so when I started asking myself, well, what was about that experience? I'm living overseas, why did I feel so much a part of that team, even more so than I have in some places in the States? Well, here's one thing. There was a lot of diversity when I was in Singapore. So one of my colleagues was from Hong Kong, another colleague was from Russia, another colleague was from Dubai, another colleague, there was no norm, right? So I think the fact that when you have at least 30% diversity on a team, and I use that term because I don't believe in saying diverse people, but 30%, you can have diversity within a group. So the fact that if you have at least 30% diversity in a group where there's gender representation, sexual orientation representation, abilities representation, nationality representation, right? Language representation, generational representation, when there is no norm. And so no one feels like the onlyest. So I think being very intentional about creating spaces that have a good mix of people like that. So I think that's one thing you can do. The second thing is, I think there are things that you can do to set up an environment to send signals to people that you are welcome here. Now, I have this unscientific theory. People come into an organization, they look around and say, can people like me be successful here? Whatever that is, your gender. Listen, at our old company where Veronica and I used to work, I used to say I felt really bad for LGBTQ people and single people, because at the time, same-sex marriage was not legal. And when you looked up, every executive was married in a heterosexual marriage. And if they got divorced, I promise to God, within 6 months, they'd be remarried. So if I'm a single person, or at the time, if I was an LGBTQ person in a same-sex relationship, I would look up there and feel like people like me can never get there. Maybe I don't want to be married, or maybe at the time legally I can't even get married, right? And so I think those signals in the environment about what success looks like, and making sure that those folks at the very top represent a diversity of experiences is super important. And doing intentional things in the environment, like prayer rooms. So if I'm a Muslim employee or student, I don't have to ask for that, because then I feel like a burden. Or mother's rooms, because as a woman with 2 children who nursed both and pumped on the road, like, having to ask for that feels like a burden. But if you've already set up the environment to account for the fact that I'm here, right? Like, those kinds of things matter. And then the last one I will tell you is being very open. So when we interview candidates for our positions, we ask them, hey, we have 10 affinity groups at our company. The Women's Network, the Black Network, Latina Network, the LGBTQ, we list them all and say, would you like to have lunch with someone from one of these communities? Or would you like to have lunch? And we don't assume what community you belong to. We list them all, so you can choose one. Or would you like to have lunch with, maybe you have a friend or colleague that you knew before you came, that already works here, that you'd like to have lunch with a friendly face, because we've been grilling you all day in the interview. So maybe there's a colleague you'd like to have lunch with. Or the third option is, maybe you just want some alone time because you're really introverted and this is very overloading, right? And so small things like that, where you can say, I see you, and I want to make this environment as comfortable as possible for you, and whatever that looks like. I know those are small things, but I do think those things matter, and they send signals to people that I'm making space for you. And you don't have to ask, because as women, particularly, we don't want to be needy, right? So every time I have to ask for a mother's room, every time I have to ask for whatever, like I feel like now I'm being the problem.
Beautiful discussion. We are over our time. Please, Miss Latasha, leave them something to think about for the rest of their life.
Listen, you all are so powerful and so honorable in the work that you do. I'm thankful for your commitment to education. I'm thankful for the commitment you're making and the lives you are changing, and you're on the front lines doing it every day. I don't take that lightly. And, I would tell you, as you are trying to dismantle these systemic barriers of inequity and rebuild them with equity in mind, I would encourage you to do so boldly. I would encourage you to do so by asking yourself, what would I have told my younger self? Knowing what I know now, what advice would I have given my younger self to be successful in this field of physics and to break out and to really be bold and daring in their research and innovation? And whatever advice you would give your younger self, that's the advice I want to make sure that you deposit into these students who are going to change the world for us. And we need them. I need them. I got bad joints already. We need them, right? So thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure being a part of this community and this discussion. So I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Veronica.
You are so welcome. Thank you.
Well, I'm so thrilled. I'm fully energized, and you've given us so much food for thought, Latasha. I'm going to be mulling this over, and you brought us right back to something that Isa put it in the chat, and she knows it's a trigger button for me. Is to really rethink assessment, because that's, I think, where a lot of injustices are being done, and unfortunately, we often rely on easy metrics to judge people, and we all know deep down that easy metrics are typically useless metrics. They're not really telling us what we want. So it's wonderful talk. Thank you so much. For joining us and out of your busy schedule. It was wonderful. Great.
Thank you so much, Miss Latasha.
My pleasure.